Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I apologize, but I'm going to be speaking in English. But even if you don't speak English, you'll understand my English better than my Spanish. Now, I'm honored to be invited here because I think this is a very hopeful moment. Cities are very important, as I'm going to be trying to explain, and the fact that you are putting together a new urban policy is really a great opportunity for the country. So I think it always is useful to try and tell you what I'm going to say before you say it, because I may not have time to finish it. My basic arguments are that cities have fundamental advantages, and that they contribute directly to human welfare, and indeed I would assert that they are the most important invention in human history. That's quite a big claim. And they're so important because they permit and facilitate specialization and agglomeration benefits. Agglomeration economies, we call it in economics, returns to scale. Cities are more productive and they give a better quality of life, and bigger cities, all else equal, provide even more. That is why people are moving of their own free will into cities. But also, of course, there are costs of cities, and costs particularly that rise with city size. Some of them we've already mentioned: congestion, obviously, but also pollution, crime, and the price of space. Now, urban policy has a vital role, but it must be based on evidence. It must be based on an understanding of how cities work and how they can work better. So we need a framework, we need goals, but in my view, and I think the evidence supports this, we do not need a dirigiste, universal national recipe. We need variety. We need to focus on what would not happen without intervention, without public policy. We need to focus on what urban policy can actually achieve. Otherwise, our policies may actually end up doing more harm than good. And in my view, there are no good solutions unless you understand the causes. So understanding the causes is critical. Now, cities, as I say, are fundamental to civilization. They're intrinsic to economic and cultural development. They provide the basis for the division of labor, but they also contribute directly to welfare. And their invention was as fundamental as the human invention of the wheel. In fact, I think you could argue that cities led to the invention of the wheel because life in cities was more productive. They gave a demand to draw in food and people from further, and therefore they gave they gave an incentive to generate improved forms of transport, of which the wheel is a notable example. The origins of cities go back at least 10,000 years to the Middle East, and they've evolved. It's a sort of Darwinian process of experimentation. They've evolved over 10,000 years, and cities have adopted what works. Marketplaces were an early innovation. Public open spaces improve the quality of life, and they drop what doesn't work. So originally, cities had city walls. They ceased to have a function, and they've disappeared. Now, cities are back on the economics agenda. I've got a bit of an apology, I think, on behalf of the economics profession. I'm an applied urban economist. They're back on the economics agenda because for about 50 years, economists largely ignored the intellectually inconvenient reality of economies of scale. Now, those who were interested in cities all knew that cities imposed costs, transport costs, congestion costs, higher prices of space. So unless those costs were compensated by benefits, cities wouldn't exist. So there had to be economies of scale, but because economists ignored economies of scale, they more or less ignored cities, and they had little to contribute to the debate about urban policy. And then, about 1990, along came Paul Krugman, who's now got a Nobel Prize, and his great intellectual contribution was to bring together the analysis of agglomeration economies and economies of scale with the mainstream of economic analysis. And I think building on that contribution, urban economics has made remarkable progress in the last 15 years and now has a great deal to say that is relevant for urban policy. And that's extremely helpful, I think, because cities are all about economic and social life. They are sources of productivity, they are sources of creativity and welfare. And why do they work? Now, the visible feature of cities are buildings, transport systems, cityscapes or parks. Those are sort of the glamorous things about cities, but they are not what cities are about. They are only a means to an end. Cities are founded on specialization, so they're about enriching human interactions economically and culturally, and of course buildings and transport systems do that. So this process of specialization is fundamental to the origins of cities. You know, think of 10,000 years ago, you had peasant farmers and you had urban occupations. So what happened in cities? Commerce, specialized craftsmen, artisans, administration, professional services, lawyers, doctors, accountants. You had cultural services, religion, and of course you then had defense and military. And in fact, if you think about it, all those are still fundamental to the function of cities and urban occupations. And cities were not just discovered in the Middle East, they emerged completely independently in China and in South America at later times. They're that important. Now, specialization brings agglomeration economies. This is important in production. We can look at it in terms of production, and we can look at it in terms of consumption. You have more specialized firms and workers, and each firm learns from other firms and improves the productiveness of other firms. And this was a story told by Alfred Marshall, a 19th century economist, in terms of the textile industry in British cities. The textile firms used common knowledge of technology and markets. They had specialized financial requirements. They benefited from large pools of specialized labor and a supply of skills. And as he put it, knowledge in cities is in the air. You learn from each other. So there are producer benefits from being close to other complementary firms, from having access to large labor markets which allow you to employ highly specialized workers, highly specialized subcontractors, and you can have specialized inputs like finance, etc. But they also give advantages to workers. They give opportunities for specialists to find jobs. And there's an interesting paper about 10 years ago called Power Couples. Now, it happens that I'm a representative of a power couple. My wife is an extremely specialized academic. I'm an extremely specialized academic. We spent 30 years of our married life not being able to get a job in the same city. 1995, we both got jobs in London. My wife at that time was commuting 2,000 kilometers a week to work in Switzerland. So we were happy to pay the high price of living in London because it allowed us to both have jobs suited to our skills and both earn decent professional incomes. But it isn't just about manufacturing that cities offer these sorts of agglomeration economies. In fact, recent research shows that agglomeration economies are more important for services and for intellectual activities. We all think of London as a financial centre, which it is, but it's also a very important cultural, industry and media centre. And if you look at the geographic location of the media industry in London, it's basically in the centre of London in Soho, and it's grown originally out of the theatre industry. So you've had theatres in London going back to Elizabethan times, and you have then actors who are famous, you have their agents who are all located in central London. So as the film industry grew, and then the television industry, and now the much more complicated visual effects and other aspects of the media industry grew, they grew up in this central area where each could access the others very rapidly. And since the stars are paid very large sums of money, you think of the production process in the media industry, in television, for example, you're going from a very cheap memory device, a few thousand pesos, to a finished product in maybe just 2 hours to make a television program. But once you've got there, your costs may be millions of pesos. So you have a huge incentive to do this as quickly as possible and get it so you can earn revenues from it, which gives you a big incentive to be located close to each other. And just to illustrate this, one of the nicest little illustrations I know in this media industry at the heart of London is that you walk along a little side street and there's a rather sort of faded doorway, and on it is painted, "Walk up composer services." So there you are making a television program, you suddenly need 10 seconds of music, you can run round the corner, you can go upstairs and you can get a composer to write you your 10 seconds of music, and you've got it. So everything is there close at hand, and this applies also in research industries, it applies in services, everywhere for face-to-face communication is important. And recent French and British studies have both independently shown that agglomeration economies are much more important in some sectors than they are in others, and they're particularly important in consultancy, in advertising, in business services, in publishing, in media, printing, and in tradable services generally. That is, they're particularly important in those things that are becoming more important in our economies. So how important are these agglomeration economies overall? Now, estimation is very difficult, and this is why you need careful research, because you get firm and worker sorting. So bigger cities, prices are higher, which means that only the most productive firms and workers can afford to live in these bigger cities. So if you're going to estimate the actual impact of simply urban size on productivity of resources, you have to abstract from this sorting process. Now, earlier estimates since 2000 suggested that there was an elasticity of overall productivity with respect to size of about 0.25, 2.5%. Some interesting work by some Spanish researchers very recently shows that it's actually rather higher. What they were able to do was to follow people over time, over 10 years. And what they found was that people who moved to cities increased their personal productivity, and that takes a period of time, about 7 years. If they then leave the city and move back to a smaller city, they retain some of that increased productivity because they retain their contacts. So the bigger cities are themselves generating more productivity in smaller cities also. And allowing for that effect, they suggest that their argument is that the elasticity of productivity with respect to urban size is about 5.5%, which, to put it into Chilean terms, means that going from a city the size of Curicó to the size of Santiago, you would increase the productivity of resources by about 11%, doing absolutely nothing else at all, just because bigger cities are more productive. And of course, it's not just agglomeration economies in production, it's also in quality of life and consumption. One of my favorite quotations from the works of Marx and Engels and the Communist Manifesto is up on the slide behind me. One of the great achievements of the bourgeoisie was that they rescued the mass of the people from the idiocy of rural life. Life in villages is very restricted, it lacks choice, and it lacks the ability to make your own decisions. It's a grind. It's a grind of poverty. And cities have released people from that. Cities generate welfare directly. They give you variety in what you can consume. They give you choice. They generate competition between suppliers. They develop individual freedom of action. They offer you cultural services, and they also offer you compatible neighbors. You can choose the neighborhood you live in because of the quality of your neighbors. So what they do is they are generators of fun. They improve people's lives. And bigger cities offer more variety than smaller cities. But, and this is the sort of the gloomy economist in me speaking, the pragmatist, the reality is that all economic choices are constrained by people's incomes. And many of the goods from which people derive welfare can only be accessed if you live in the right location. And the same is true of these sorts of goods, that your ability to consume them is determined by how rich you are, as it is of all other goods. So if you want to get your children into a better school, certainly in England, you have to buy a house close to the better school. If you want clean air in your neighborhood, if you want peace and tranquility, if you want a lower crime rate, if you want good views, if you want access to parks, if you want compatible neighbors, you have to pay for it. They're only consumable if you live in the right location or the right neighborhood. You have specialized neighborhoods in cities, just as you have economic specialization, and the bigger the city, the more and more specialized neighborhoods it has. So a huge city like London doesn't just have for example, a Jewish neighborhood, it has a liberal Jewish neighborhood, and it has a conservative Jewish neighborhood, and it has an ultra-Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. So it has a Korean neighborhood, it has a neighborhood for Punjabis, it has a neighborhood for Japanese. It's a huge range of different types of neighborhood which serve different types of interests and groups. And we can see how this, I'll go through this rather quickly to save time, we can see this working in the housing market, and recent work in urban economics has actually provided pretty good estimates of this. Before doing that, what about the costs of city size? I've given you arguments why bigger cities are more productive, both for economic output and for welfare, but I've also said that there are costs of urban size. So there's congestion, pollution, space costs, which are external costs, and they rise with city size. So should we therefore limit the size of cities? Should we put a brake on urban growth? Now, the reality is, and it's true in Chile as we were hearing earlier today, the reality is that in many OECD countries, there are growth constraints. There are limits on urban expansion through land use planning. And the research has been giving us pretty good answers on how important agglomeration economies are, but there's less information on how costs rise with city size until some very recent research done by some French economists, which actually suggests that costs of size do not rise very rapidly after a threshold. So they rise quite quickly as cities get from sort of 10,000 to 250,000, but after they get beyond 250,000 or so, costs only rise very slowly, which suggests that there's actually rather doubtful evidence in favor of urban growth controls on the basis of improving outcomes for society as a whole. But of course, markets may fail, and we need intervention. We need intervention because of monopoly in markets. We need intervention because of so-called externalities, that is, goods or bads, which impact on people's welfare or on their ability to produce but are not reflected in prices. And of course, we need intervention to provide public goods. public goods like parks, open space, cityscape, wildlife habitat, that the market won't provide because there's no price that you can reasonably charge for them. And that's the nature of public goods, and therefore public goods are provided by either public provision or else by clubs. Like in Britain you have the National Trust, for example, or in the United States you have the Sierra Club, who help try to provide conservation. But move on now to recent empirical work on land and housing markets, and move on from agglomeration economies, because the work that's been done has told us a lot about how cities work and deliver welfare. Because, as I mentioned earlier, you have particular goods and indeed bads, the consumption of which is dependent on the exact location in which you live or indeed work. And the value of these goods and bads is capitalized into land and space costs. And it's capitalized, the evidence shows, not just in terms of current prices, but in terms of future expected levels. So, for example, there's some work being recently done in Berlin where they've announced a new airport, and then they changed the opening date of the airport, and they changed the flight paths of the planes, and it was shown that this was reflected in house prices even though these changes wouldn't occur for 5 or 10 years. Or I've got a student, in fact, who did some very interesting work on Crossrail. Crossrail is a new express commuter service line that's now being dug under central London. It's a new metro, 80 kilometres or more long, and it's going to add to London the equivalent of a city the size of Frankfurt. It's a really major project. Now, this student of mine found that offices close to the stations that Crossrail would serve in central London, their value increased 5% just when the funding was announced. When the actual work, construction work started, the value of these offices close to the central stations increased by 20%. So people value this additional accessibility, and it's reflected in the prices of real estate. A colleague of mine has done an evaluation of the extension of London's metro system, the Underground, which again used the increase in house prices consequent upon the new Jubilee Line extension of the Underground, showing that there was a value uplift as a result of the improved access. So if you put this information together with the distribution of incomes which we observe in society, that explains patterns of residential segregation. Because it's very simple. Basically, nicer neighborhoods cost more. Poor people have to live in cheaper neighborhoods. I'm not saying this is good or bad, it's simply the way it is. I've done quite a lot of work on this. The underlying economic theory is that people's incomes are dependent on access to jobs, so they value the access to jobs. So people will pay more to have quick transport, close proximity to higher paying jobs. Now, these tend to be in the center of cities, in the CBD, so people will pay more for better access to the CBD. And we already had this pointed out this morning in terms of the traveling times of rich people compared to poor people in Santiago. So there's a sort of trade-off between the price of space and the cost of getting to the center of the city. And the further you go out from the center in terms of time and cost, the cheaper land and housing will tend to be. And this gives you a very simple theory which explains the overall function land rent price, but it also, because it explains land rent prices of space, it allows you to determine the consumption of space given incomes and therefore densities of occupation at all locations within the city. Now, you can put this together with analyzing housing markets. Houses are complex goods with lots of different attributes. Traditional real estate people tend to argue that no house is the same as any other house. That's true. But if you divide houses into all their different attributes, how much space they offer, quality of construction, how high up they are, and the location they give you with respect to income earning opportunities, how far they are from the city centre basically, and the access that they provide you to those things in cities that give a higher quality of life, like better schools or parks or good views or clean air or low crime rates, then you can estimate the price of all these individual attributes, and the price of a house ends up, you can estimate it on the basis of the sum of all the different attributes which a particular house embodies. And if you've got a big enough sample of transactions, you can actually estimate these models. And I've been guilty of doing quite a lot of this work myself. I won't bother you with that. So since about 1980, when urban economists first sort of developed this, there's been now thousands of studies done. And they've improved. The quality's improved. Much has been learned. And the results have been based on even bigger and bigger data sets. So I've got a colleague who's just run a model with over 1 million observations of transactions in it, what people were paying for these different attributes of housing. And of course, you've got more and more sophisticated ways of modeling it. So now, for example, I'm using 3-dimensional GIS systems in order to calculate the view that you've got from every level in every office building in central London. We have a 3-dimensional model of London. And therefore, you can estimate what the attributes are of every house and indeed office. Another colleague of mine has just estimated the impact on house values, what people are prepared to pay, not to have electricity generating turbines close to their houses. Again, with a very large data set. And two general points come out of these sorts of studies, called hedonic studies. One is that there tend to be quantity discounts, that people pay a lot for the first few meters of garden space, but if your garden space gets bigger and bigger, they pay less for additional garden size, given the size of the house. So there's a sort of quantity discount on many of these attributes. But for some attributes, there's actually a quantity premium. That in the housing market, people are seeking out not just a decent quality of some attribute, but the best that's available. And that seems to be particularly true of schooling. People pay very large sums of money to buy a house that's in the catchment area, not of a decent school, but of the best state school in the local area. And the second thing that comes out of these studies is that the prices interact. There isn't one price of parks and open space, for example. The further you live from a park, the less impacted house, the less you have to pay for access. So the most valuable people are willing to pay much higher prices to live close to parks than to live a long way away. But what they pay interacts with the local crime rate. So in Baltimore in the United States, for example, where there's a very high crime rate, you actually find that in the highest crime neighborhoods, parks are a disadvantage, not an advantage. People pay a premium to live further away from them because parks in a very high crime neighborhood are essentially places you can get mugged or you can buy dope. They're not places you can walk the dog and you have fun with your children. There's an interaction between the value of open space and the density of the neighborhood. People will pay more to live close to a park in a high-density neighborhood than they will in a low-density neighborhood. Not surprising, because you get green space in your back garden if you live in a low-density neighborhood. There's an interaction between how good a school is and the size of the house. The more suitable a house is for holding children, the higher the price that people will pay for a given quality of school. These are all sensible things. So this is an example of work I did in the town of Reading, which is about 60 kilometers west of London. So that's an actual estimate of the value of land in Reading without including well, you can't really see that, without including these neighborhood attributes that give value to houses. And as you added in additional neighborhood attributes, you find that you get a clearer representation of how land values fall as you move further away from the city center, because in the initial one, you're reflecting in the value of land the value of all these local attributes like neighborhood amenities and the quality of the neighborhood that were getting capitalized into house prices. So this is, if you like, extracting the value of these capitalized goods and just showing how the value of land varies with access to the center of the city. Another thing you might notice is that it's not symmetrical, and that's because the transport system in this city runs east-west. The River Thames goes through it, so that causes congestion going north-south, and so the cost of accessing the center increases more rapidly as you go north-south compared to east-west. Now later, after these estimates, they built a new highway coming in from the south. So that improved access to the south, and lo and behold, when you estimated the new land rent surface, you found that this was reflected and that land prices declined less rapidly going south along the new line of the new transport system. And this simply reflects how you can use these sorts of models to actually value what improved transport contributes to the welfare of urban citizens. So it appears that on a wide range of these neighborhood-type goods, these locational goods, it's capitalized, fully capitalized into the prices people pay for houses, and it's not just the current value of these characteristics, but the expected future ones. Like you know that there's going to be a new airport, that's already going to be reflected in house prices. You know there's going to be an improved school, that will immediately be reflected in house prices. But people are buying accessibility to jobs, to income-earning opportunities. So, of course, an identical house in a city like New York or London will be worth a lot more than an identical house in a city like Detroit, because income opportunities in Detroit are much lower than in New York. And this is estimates of the value of the best school, access to the better schools in Reading. So on the horizontal axis, more or less, you've got school quality improving for first grade schools. On the north-south axis, you've got school quality improving for secondary schools. And what you're going to see is it's a very non-linear effect. People are essentially paying a premium to get into the very best schools. And this has a huge impact on house prices. So if you take a sample mean house and you move it from the worst school catchment area to the best school catchment area, the price increases by 33%. It's a big hit. And for secondary schools, it's a bit less. It's about 18%. So people pay an awful lot through the housing market to buy these locational goods. So what's the conclusion from this? Free goods in cities are not free. You may provide them through the taxation system, but they're allocated like other private goods, but via the housing market, because their values are capitalized in house prices. Richer people buy access to the best state schools or parks via the housing market. And this tells you that social or residential segregation is simply the spatial articulation of the income distribution in the society. Policy may attempt to generate mixed communities, but that is tackling not the cause of spatial segregation, but the symptom of inequality in the wider society. Evidence shows that when people are left to choose for themselves, they choose to live with their peers. And that's not just true for richer people, it's also true for poorer people. Poorer people get benefit from living in a community where there are support services suitable for their low incomes, where there is access to the appropriate facilities, where they have friends and neighbors who will give them information about job opportunities in the wider city, for example. Also, and this is disappointing news, upgrading neighborhoods prices the poor out. It doesn't help the poor. It actually damages the poor. Because all consumption choices are constrained by incomes. Poor people can't afford rich neighborhoods. And if you make a neighborhood more desirable by putting a new metro station there, extending the metro service, or by building a park, then this will get priced into housing prices, and the poor will be squeezed out to other areas that may be even worse. And greater societal inequality generates sharper residential segregation because the rich are relatively more able to outbid the poor for the good things that cities offer. So if you go to Finland, where there's a very egalitarian distribution of income, and you look at Helsinki, you'll find very little social segregation, which I think is excellent. But that's not because they have policies to not have residential segregation in Finland. It's because the Finnish education system is outstandingly good, and they have a very egalitarian distribution of income in the population. London, on the other hand, is an uneven income distribution, and we have quite sharp residential segregation. Chile, we know, has a very uneven distribution of income, and you have even more sharp residential segregation in your big cities. But policy should worry about poor people, not about poor neighborhoods. We need to help poor people to get better off, not to put a park into a poor neighborhood. Because when they get richer, they'll be able to afford a neighborhood that has a decent park. So upgrading neighborhoods actually prices the poor out. So the second question is there any evidence that in fact poor people are worse off living in poor neighborhoods? Because there's no point in having a policy that attempts to mix poor and rich people up unless this actually improves the quality of life and the opportunities of poor people. And there actually is some quite useful evidence on this. In the United States, they started in the early 1990s a program called the Moving to Opportunities program, set up in 1992. And the idea of this was to move poor people from poor neighborhoods into more affluent neighborhoods. And it was a reasonably well set up trial. It was a quasi-experiment. They divided, it was in 5 cities, nearly 5,000 families, and they were randomly allocated into 3 groups. Group 1 got financial and professional help to move to an affluent neighborhood. Group 2 just got vouchers to choose better housing, but only housing for themselves. Group 3 got no help, but they could move if they were able to. Now, this has been followed up now over nearly 20 years. And the results are not straightforward, but they are quite negative. It's quite clear that the adults who moved from poor neighborhoods to richer neighborhoods got no benefit out of it whatsoever. Their life, their economic opportunities, their earning, their unemployment did not improve. For adolescents, there was some suggestion that maybe girls improved in some ways, but there was statistically significant evidence that adolescent boys actually became more likely to be arrested for crime and did worse in schooling. And there was some evidence of health improvements for adults, but there may have been other ways that these could have been achieved. Now, I've got a PhD student, Felix Weinhardt, who did a sort of other way around study in Britain, looking at people who were not necessarily poor, who were forced to move to very poor neighborhoods. And he found a symmetric outcome, that they did no worse in their schooling whatsoever, even though they were forced to go to some of the worst schools in England. Another way of trying to identify whether there are these neighborhood effects that mean that people's lives are worse from living among concentrated poor people is to so-called cohort studies. You track people over a long time. One of the first of these was in Canada, tracking people over 30 years, and this found that how they did in the labor market, their incomes and their quality of life was completely unrelated to the type of neighborhood they'd originated in. In Britain, there's a fairly recent study done, only 10-year tracking, but equally it finds no effect of neighborhood of origin on life outcomes. A more recent study in Scotland was interested in whether living in a concentrated area of social housing made people less likely to succeed, and again, 10-year follow-up, no impact whatsoever. There's a study in Sweden where they have a policy of mixing migrants into mixed neighborhoods rather than into ethnically specialized neighborhoods, which actually finds that those migrants who came in from poor countries and were forced to live amongst Swedes did worse 10 years later than those migrants who were able to live amongst other people from their countries of origin. So there really is no evidence that mixing communities improves the life of poor people. We need other sorts of policies to do that. I'll quickly flip over this. It's simply saying that cities are making a comeback and why they're making a comeback. To come to the more sort of try to apply some of these ideas to the National Urban Development Policy that was published recently. Now, to state the obvious, urban policy must be based on a diagnosis of causes, because there's a danger if you don't understand why you've got a problem that your policy makes that problem worse. And it also is obvious that urban policy, should only address policies that urban policy can actually deal with. Urban policy should not slavishly follow markets because we know that there's market failure. But they should work with what I call work with the grain of markets. They need to take account of how markets work as they intervene. And I think that the evidence challenges a lot of conventional policy wisdoms. So, social integration. This is a section of the urban development proposals. Towards the end of the paper, there's a simple report that Chile, with a Gini coefficient of 0.49, is the OECD country with the greatest inequality. Incomes are very unequally distributed in Chile, and it follows from that I disagree very strongly with the section on social integration, because it confuses causes and consequences of residential segregation. The problem and the cause is the extent of social inequality in this country. Mixed communities require significant investment in poor neighborhoods. You're going to be putting in resources to generate open space, public facilities, improve transport. That is a waste of resources. It's not saying that the city doesn't need better transport and better open space. It does. But it's not going to help the poor if they're directed to poor neighborhoods, because it's simply going to cause the poor to be priced out of those neighborhoods. The problem is poverty. The problem is not distressed neighborhoods. And policy should treat poverty. I'm an egalitarian. I believe in more equality in society. What we need is to put additional educational resources into those schools that serve the poor. We need more very simple training to improve the employability and skills of the unskilled. There was someone I was talking to in London who was running a program like this, who said that his training basically consisted of trying to get 13-year-olds who'd never been to school to turn up at 9 o'clock when they said they would be there at 9 o'clock, and to smile instead of growl. The very, very simple life skills many people do not have which they can be taught. You need preschool help. You need to help the very young children, because that's when help is most useful. You need better delivered and better tailored, designed welfare services. And you probably need extra policing in high crime areas. You don't want to have even policing across all areas. So yes, you want to focus particular policy delivery in poor areas, but you don't worry about the buildings and the neighborhoods, you worry about the people who live in them. Economic development, this section has a lot of useful and valuable recommendations, although I have a real problem with land value capture unless it's in the form of impact fees. History of attempts to capture land value uplift with any form of taxation or levies is, you would be amazed how long the history of failure is. It goes back 700 years and it has never worked. And there are very good reasons why it doesn't work, which I'd be happy to answer in the questions and answer later. But on the other hand, impact fees, where developers have to pay the costs of additional infrastructure and other costs that their development imposes on the community, those do work. And they're capitalized into land prices, so essentially all that happens is the land price goes down to pay for these costs that really are necessary in order to support that development. Land policy does need, as was said earlier, to ensure a plentiful supply of land. By restricting land supply, that's what increases price. Planners don't always think of it like this, but planning, urban planning, is at its heart an economic activity. It's allocating a scarce resource. And if you don't allocate enough of a scarce resource, the price goes up. So urban planning in determining land supply needs to take account of the price of land for development. Not just for housing, but the price of land for other sorts of development, because you want flexibility. You want to be able to change land use where society and the economy is demanding that you make that change. So there are ways in which planning decisions can build in price information to help them make useful, equitable, and efficient decisions about land allocation. No time to go into it here, but it's explained in this book that I published last year. So you can all go out and buy my book. So we've got problems of market failure in land markets because the value of any parcel of land depends on the activities that are occurring on other parcels of land, and particularly because we have this problem of how do you provide public goods like cityscape and parks and open spaces. Markets won't necessarily do that efficiently, so there's a very strong case for planning as a, if you like, a system of regulating patterns of land use. But the exact location, and this is again something that research I've been doing recently demonstrates with appalling, I would say, tragic importance, how important the exact location is for the productivity of particular activities, particularly for offices and for retail. So we have a planning policy in Britain that determines where retail can be located on particular sites. This was introduced in 1996, and the work we've done demonstrates pretty clearly that this has reduced the total factor productivity in the supermarket sector by 32%. That's like a decade of lost productivity as a result of a policy forcing retail to go onto unproductive sites. But space in housing is critical for welfare, and as people get richer, they seek more space. It's part of what makes people better off. As they get better off, they want more space in their houses and more space in their gardens. We also have problems of congestion and pollution, and the transport economists have been arguing since 1964 that the way to deal with congestion is to price it. And I use the word price congestion carefully, not taxation. If you call it taxation, then ministries of finance will say you can only use this as general tax revenues. You can't use it to improve your transport systems, but we do need to improve our transport systems. So if you think of it as simply pricing an externality, which is technically very easy, then it should give city governments an opportunity to recycle the revenues into improving the transport for their city. Because transport is vital to how cities work. It underlies agglomeration economies. I was saying how important agglomeration economies are. They result from the ability of people to interact productively with each other. So if you lower transport costs, you increase the agglomeration economies subject to the size. So in Britain, I'm glad to say, we now have a system which includes these additional agglomeration economy benefits in our evaluation of transport proposals. So this new Crossrail route I was talking about, going across central London, 80 kilometres long, allowed for the additional agglomeration economies that would result from building it in determining whether it was worthwhile. So better transport, reduced congestion, even vertical height in buildings. There's evidence that shows that taller buildings, everything else equal, are more productive because there are vertical agglomeration economies as well as, so to speak, horizontal agglomeration economies. On the other hand, there's very little evidence of which I'm aware that polycentricity has any advantages to it. It increases the volume of traffic from satellite centres to satellite centres, which is much less efficient than radial transport routes, which can use mass transit. Pollution at the urban level, I would argue, is largely an issue of particulates and NO2. And there are technological fixes to that sort of pollution. Road traffic is a particular source of that sort of pollution, so you need to have regulation and pricing to restrict that pollution. But it's fixable. It has serious health implications, but it is fixable. The same with industrial pollution. I'm rather more positive about cycling as a solution to urban transport problems than was suggested by one of our earlier speakers. There are external benefits to cycling. It's a way of dealing with congestion, but it's fixable. It does require proper infrastructure. If you go to Amsterdam, 38% of all urban journeys are made by bicycle because they have proper cycling facilities, and their cycling facilities are built into their transport system. In terms of the wider problem of carbon footprint and global warming, cities are wonderful. They're very beneficial. If you look at the countries with the lowest carbon footprint per dollar of GDP, they're Hong Kong and Singapore by far, which are essentially urban city-states. So we do need policy on new buildings, on retrofitting old buildings with better insulation, but essentially that's a national problem and a global problem. It's not fixable at the urban scale, although it's a very important problem. Institutionally and governance. Spatial boundaries do matter in terms of the efficiency of government for cities. You have national policies, you have urban regional policies, and you have local neighborhood policies. And policies are more efficient, and again there's recent research underpinning this. They're more efficient if the policy is formulated and implemented and paid for at the level where the benefits of the policy coincide with the costs of the policy. So you need national policy for major infrastructure, and you certainly need national policy for redistribution. Attempting to engineer redistribution at the urban level has negative results because rich people leave the area with a higher tax rate. So you need national redistribution. But on the other hand, the urban region is the most efficient level at which to have local economic development strategies, strategic transport planning, and strategic land use planning. And there's evidence now showing, I've contributed to the OECD recently published a paper on this, showing that cities that have a tier of government coinciding with their functional reality actually perform better in economic terms. And Chile is lucky in some sense that it has a history of having urban regions as units which it analyzes. And the other thing that you need with governance is transparency and simplicity. Complex rules, overlapping responsibilities, and above all, discretionary decision-making are recipes for failure. You need to develop a plan and then stick with the plan and implement the plan. So there's a big difference between the way that we do it in Britain, which is incredibly inefficient, where we use development control and every decision becomes a political argument, and master planning, which Europe uses. If you want to see effective urban planning, I suggest you go to Holland or Germany or possibly Switzerland. So if you have a clear set of rules and a clear plan and regulations, then it minimizes the transactions costs. It increases certainty, it reduces risk, and it eliminates what I would call deadweight, economists call deadweight losses, lawyers' fees, for example. So there's, I think, a danger in some parts of overcomplexity and not clear lines of responsibility, and therefore the politicization of decisions, because one body will be arguing for one solution and another body will be arguing for another solution. You need clear lines of responsibility and clear rules. So conclusions. Cities are important. And because they're so important, we need to understand them better before we start rolling out a dirigiste policy. We need to be cautious and flexible. We need to know how they work in order to have appropriate policies. We know that bigger cities, we do have research showing that bigger cities are more productive and generate more welfare. But we also know they give rise to bigger costs, so we need policies which reduce those costs. We need to price congestion, we need to keep down space costs by allocating enough land and being flexible with height controls. We need pollution controls with regulation. And I just make the point in passing that, interestingly, crime is actually a falling problem in cities. Crime rates are falling in big cities all over OECD countries. It's extraordinary what's happened to crime over the last 30 years. We also know that cities are vital and they're becoming more important, but we still don't know that much about how they work. And they've evolved in this sort of evolutionary way, adopting what works, experimentation, dropping what doesn't work. So the danger of imposing a uniform policy is that it's a sort of hubris. It's imposing on cities and it's reducing their ability to experiment. You need to be able to reward experiments that work and transfer them to other cities rather than trying to make everybody do the same, particularly since the solutions will vary from city to city. So we need flexibility, we need to facilitate change, and we need to allow experimentation in what we do in our cities. So policy makers also need to view change as an opportunity, not as a threat. They need to learn to ride the wave, if you like. Cities are always changing, and one of the problems is that some cities will decline. So policy needs to be able to manage decline as well as manage growth. So the best policies, in my view, are actually not very glamorous. They don't involve going out and cutting red tape and having dramatic interventions. They simply work on small-scale things to make cities better places to live and work and to make them more efficient. So we need to work on the prices and the quality of cities. We need to reduce costs, and that means we need to invest in transport and price congestion, use our road systems more efficiently. We need to have an efficient public service that delivers transparently so the rules are clear to everybody. We need a government level for the metro region for relevant functions like transport, economic development, and strategic planning. We need to have local fiscal resources. We do need a local tax base because that provides an incentive to cities to grow. But we don't want a policy that tries to pick winners. We need flexibility and facilitation not division. We need more concern and focus on people and the human skills and less on where people live. So we need to worry about the welfare of people, not the welfare of buildings. Buildings will take care of themselves if people have adequate resources. But we do need urban policies, but we also need research and evidence to underpin those policies. And I'll just leave you with a picture which I think, in a sense, is a great warning against urban growth constraints. This is, since 1892, the price of land and the price of housing space in England. You'll see between 1892 and about 1955, the real price, so it's taking out inflation, the real price of land and the real price of housing did not increase at all. In 1955, we introduced green belts, which are like very rigid urban growth constraints. Since then, the price of land for housing has increased 15.5-fold, and the price of housing has increased 5-fold, in real terms. London now has the least affordable housing of any big city in the world. So, as a warning as well as an opportunity. So thank you very much indeed. I'll stop there.